Okay, I know a lot about this area. I joined my first frequent flyer program in 1985. And I've spent more time discussing, often with my father and other family members, but I have a deep knowledge of loyalty programs. Would be happy to talk about this on the ski lift later, to compare credit cards and so forth. Some of the history of this, the first frequent flyer program was started by Robert Crandall at American Airlines back in 1981. That's him in the lower right. And I've read many interviews with him. What he had in mind was purely a marketing program. The paper talks essentially about these loyalty programs reducing the switch or increasing the switching costs and keeping you flying on the same airline. And Crandall's innovation was widely copied, of course, by all of the airlines. But the loyalty programs go back in time, and I think the original one was S&H Green Stamps in 1896. And I think there may be people of a certain age, they're mostly sitting over here, who would have the same childhood memories of me, of accumulating these green stamps in little books that you could then trade in for a baseball glove or gardening tools or something like that. But the program worked basically because people valued the green stamps at way more than the cost of the rewards. And it's identical to the behavior we're seeing today with the credit cards, that nothing's really changed, that this is an 1896 idea that's been brought into the modern economy by American Express and Chase and so forth. One of the points I will make by the end of the discussion is that the loyalty here is really more to the credit card company than it is to the airline, at least in the way that it's framed in this paper. So I think Dan has correctly located the paper in the literature. There are many ways to raise debt capital that go far beyond the classical banks and bondholders. If you're a startup green energy company, you can borrow money from the government under its ESG programs and maybe get very rich doing that. It's ironic how what goes around comes around. The customers contribute many forms of debt. These seat licenses that pay for the construction of sports stadiums. The earliest example of this that I found were customers of medieval cathedrals, that the great churches of Europe were bought essentially by people purchasing the pews in the front row. And we wouldn't have, Chartres Cathedral, Notre Dame, and so forth, if not for this raising money from customers. You can raise money from employees through inside debt. And the pension plan that you see on a corporate balance sheet, very similar to the frequent flyer plan liability that you see, at least since 2018, in an airline's balance sheet. So the idea here is, very simple, that as a customer, you're supposed to be overpaying for your ticket because you're promised free travel later. That, if I pay 10 or 20% more than the cost of providing the service, I'm going to make it back later if I strategically cash in the miles. It turns out, though, that the success of this model seems to really come not from loyalty to the airline and repeat business, but from acquiring a credit card that is co-branded and really using it not to purchase air travel, but to purchase groceries or put gas in your car or whatever. And a lot of this model in every direction is undermined by the power that the airline retains. The airline can unilaterally change the terms of trade. I think almost everyone in the room has been victimized by this at some point. And you also have the risk that the airline could go bankrupt. In fact, I wouldn't even call this a risk, because with probability 1, every airline in the history, they've all gone bankrupt, many of them multiple times. So I'm a million miler on United Airlines, and so I have a certain status for life, and I can nominate my spouse to share this status, which I have, but I've pointed out to her that this is for the life either of me or United Airlines, whichever is less. And I'm 62, but I fully expect to outlive United Airlines. So, they've gone bankrupt 3 times, and in each bankruptcy, there's the issue of whether the other debt holders wish for the loyalty points to be wiped out. A big issue that really doesn't appear in the model is that the airline business is a fixed cost business. You have to buy an airplane. And there's data on the cost of a point. We'll look at this in a moment. But to fly me across the country, a good rule of thumb is it's about 2 cents a mile. So if they're going to take me 3,000 miles from New York to Los Angeles, the variable cost to the airline is about $60. They're going to sell me that ticket for 10 to 15 times as much because they need to cover the fixed costs of the plane, which covers, it's like $100 million. And the paper kind of glides over this and just talks about operating cost. But operating cost is really a depreciation schedule that does not involve cash flows at all. And this is really something ultimately that is negotiated with the government as part of the tax code. So there's an interesting corporate finance history of these loyalty programs, and it really begins in 2005 when Air Canada carved out its frequent flyer program and listed it. It was called Aeroplan, and they listed it on the Ontario Stock Exchange so that you could invest directly in the shares of the loyalty program, and Air Canada retained a majority controlling interest. So this was a classic equity carve-out. And what surprised everybody, including Air Canada, I think, is that the performance of the loyalty program in financial terms was way better than the airline. And so the question was naturally raised, shouldn't all the airlines do this? And rather than just carve this out, should this be a total spin-off where they just set it free? And I put this on the final exam for my restructuring course that I've taught for many years and asked the students, when I see something weird, I crowdsource it by putting it on the final exam. And essentially ask the students, does this make sense? And they came up with a number of really big concerns. One is that Air Canada could go bankrupt, in fact has gone bankrupt and probably will go bankrupt again. And where would that leave the loyalty program? The loyalty program could defect. They could start offering miles in Delta or British Airways or whatever. And ultimately, you can't separate these businesses. There are too many needs for coordination. And the conclusion of the paper, which I put in quotes, that firms should aim to decouple the reward issuance from the business. I don't think this actually works because ultimately the marketing is critical and you're at great risk of a monopsony, monopoly holdout situation if you really set these things free. So Air Canada actually stepped back and carved this thing back in and brought it back under the corporate umbrella. If you look around, though, there's all kinds of structures that are being experimented with. And on the far left is sort of the classical approach where you simply have the program integrated into the company. In the middle is where you've got some sort of internal reincorporation, but a 100% wholly owned subsidiary. And on the right are cases where companies have actually floated minority interests on the exchange and asked investors to put a value on the loyalty program. I think there are big problems with this, though, and the first one is the allocation of fixed cost. That if I spin off this loyalty program and keep all of the fixed costs behind on the airline, of course the airline's going to be less profitable. But ultimately, this is a question about strategic accounting and who has a higher marginal tax rate, who can use the depreciation tax shields and so forth. And I think that when you look at some of these situations where firms are monkeying around with who owns the loyalty program, there's got to be a tax arbitrage story, not too far from the surface. This is the difference between the airline's valuation of the mile and the customer's valuation of the mile. The table on the lower right is reproduced from the paper. TPG is the points guy. And it's nice to see the points guy cited because it's a wonderful go-to website. Did you know the points guy is a woman? This is a modern day George Eliot, and I saw her interviewed recently. But essentially the miles are discounted by a good 50% in most cases. Now, on the left is also a graphic from the paper, but this is, I think, imported directly from Delta Airlines, where they talk about how they purchase miles. The SkyMiles frequent flyer program purchase it from the airline. This is not an arm's length negotiation. This is an internal transfer price. And I think, again, this is purely strategic accounting. The proper transfer price is somewhere between the numbers. For Delta, you see at the top that, in fact, it's almost 3x what they sell them for relative to what the consumer values them for. But this is purely a made-up number. And it's created, again, probably to maximize some type of tax shield, but also to manipulate earnings as the need arises to make the airline appear more solvent than it really is. And I think between the allocation of fixed cost and the establishment of internal transfer prices of the miles, there's just all kinds of shenanigans that even Jack Welch might be embarrassed by, if you saw this going on. But I want to come back to what I think is really the main point here. The data strongly show, and I think the model in the paper really supports the idea that the loyalty programs here are really focused on the pass-through of the miles as an amenity that's connected to a credit card. And it's the loyalty to the credit card and not to the airline that really matters here. In this case with Delta, it's the loyalty, I think, to JP Morgan Chase. I forget who issues the United Explorer credit card, but it's a lot like the job market paper of Ulrika Malmendier about going to the gym, where you buy the gym membership but don't actually ever go to the gym, but you feel better that you've done it. Here, a lot of people accumulate miles and they don't really redeem them. In fact, when you die, you get, the balance is zeroed out. And I think these credit cards are really a bad deal. They have high fees. They really don't give you the amenities that are commensurate for what you're paying for. And I think, the banks and credit card companies that have figured out how to do this should be admired for their marketing prowess. And as consumers, you should avoid these, completely. Although there are exceptions, which, I would, again, be happy to talk about. But the story here is really not about the airlines. You can, accumulate zillions of miles on these credit cards without ever taking even one flight on United. And to me, that's not loyalty to the airline at all. It's simply loyalty to an amenity program where there's an interesting interaction that I think has a lot of connections to behavioral finance. Okay, that's what I've got, and I'll stop here. Thanks.